Good morning, everyone, and welcome to another webinar brought to you by CargoNOW and the Chartered Institute of Logistics and Transport Singapore. My name is Joe Lombardo. I'm the editor of the Logistics magazine. And to explain to you about CargoNOW, I would like to introduce my co-host, Bob Gill, who is the General Manager for Southeast Asia, ARC Advisory Group. Bob, if you'd like to introduce CargoNOW to us.
Yes, good morning, everybody. Thanks, Joe. So CargoNOW is a sister publication and brand to Logisim. And you may have attended previous Logisim webinars. This is the first webinar organized by CargoNOW. So as well as a series of webinars, we have a publication, we have a website, and next year on March 10th and 11th, we have an exhibition taking place at Singapore Expo. So a whole host of activities around supply chain logistics under the CargoNOW umbrella, and very excited that this webinar is the one that's kicking this off. So so I look forward to this morning and to this session this morning. So over to you, Joe.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Bob, for a brief introduction. So the title of our webinar today is Sustainable Food Supply Chains, the Challenges and Opportunities. And to discuss this very interesting topic, we have today two very interesting guests, Professor Dr. Rajesh Piplani, who's Associate Professor at the Nanyang Technological University, and Mr. Andre Menezes, who is the co-founder and Chief Operating Officer at Next Gen Protein. Gentlemen, good morning and welcome, and thank you for your time being with us today.
Good morning, everyone.
Right, so can I ask the first question to both of our guests? If you could share with us a little bit about your background, experience, and briefly give us an update of some significant achievements in your career. Let's start with Professor Piplani first.
Yeah, so Joe, I've been with NTU for 21 plus years. Before that, I was with TI in their supply chain system development group. At NTU, I ran the Center for Supply Chain Management from 2002 to 2009. And for the last 8 years, I have been the director for the MSc, the Master's Program in Supply Chain Logistics. And besides my role at NTU, I also conduct executive education programs for companies. I've run programs for PSA, Army, Singapore Army, Navy, Air Force, Singapore Customs. And I have also done some consulting projects for companies where we model their as-is and to-be supply chain.
Excellent. Excellent. Thank you, Prof. Can I ask Andre Menezes the same question, your background, a brief update of your background experience, and what are you think the most significant achievements of your career so far?
Good morning, Joe. Good morning, everyone. Thanks for the opportunity to be here. Well, over the last 7.5 years, I've been heavily involved and fully focused on the food industry, namely meat, and in different stages of the value chain. So for 3 years, I was in Brazil with BRF, which is the largest poultry exporter in the world. And with BRF, I was actually planning the supply chain for international markets and later on for Brazil as well, which during that phase, my biggest challenge and achievement was to stabilize with transparency, the right tools, the right processes to stabilize along. At the same time, build up the capability to react swiftly to unexpected events. That was on a BRF perspective on an upstream side. Later on, I came to SETS BRF, which was a joint venture between BRF and SETS in Singapore 4.5 years ago. And SETS BRF, now called Country Foods, is the biggest importer and distributor of food and meat in Singapore. And then my challenge was to the other side of the table to make an operational turnaround, financial turnaround, while having a sustainable food supply chain. Obviously, we couldn't allow ourselves to have any issues in terms of food security, food safety, and this was obviously one of the main topics in my agenda as general manager of SETS BRF. And now, recently, I just co-founded and I'm the co-founder and CEO of Next Gen Protein, a plant-based meat company just incorporated in Singapore February this year.
Okay, Andrew, that's a great introduction. Thank you for that. But so let me follow up with a question about what is your definition of a sustainable food supply chain?
Well, in my view, sustainable food supply chain is a supply chain that is equipped with the right elements to allow it to react to different shocks. When I say different shocks, could be from different nature, different severity, and different duration, in a way that it doesn't really get disrupted to the final output.
Okay, but isn't that the same as resilience then? What's your definition of resilience versus the sustainability of a food supply chain?
Well, I think that those two are fairly connected in a way. Resilience, yes, obviously getting the shocks right, but on a sustainable side of things, doing all this with the minimum, with the maximum amount of diversity and the minimum amount of energy and effort implied in it.
Okay, so that's your experience in the real world. Prof, what is your definition of sustainability and resilience in the supply chain? How do you differentiate the two? Because clearly that's very important, understanding how to address the challenges and the opportunities.
Sure. So when you talk about sustainable supply chains, you're talking about supply chains. So this is a definition everybody agrees on, which can meet the needs of the present generation without compromising the needs of the future generations.
Right, okay.
And in order for them to do that, they need to be, of course, profitable to all the stakeholders.
Okay.
But they also need to provide broad-based benefits to society, especially the most upstream player in the supply chain, the farmer.
Right.
And then at the same time, the supply chain should not be harming the environment or depleting natural resources.
Okay.
So resilience follows from that. So a resilient supply chain is one which is able to come back to its original state as quickly as possible after disruption.
Right, right. Okay, that's excellent. And where do you see the biggest vulnerabilities, Prof, in the food chain? Because clearly resilience is important, sustainability is important, but because of the nature of food, the freshness, the time to market, there are many vulnerabilities there. So where do you see the biggest vulnerabilities as a normal supply chain, but also when you have disruptions or crises creeping into the equation?
Yeah, so I'll just mention two. One, the food supply chains are increasingly prone to more frequent disruptions.
Right.
We are seeing increasingly natural disasters like floods and droughts and hurricanes disrupting the supply chains.
Right.
The second vulnerability I would say is in terms of resource sustainability. So water availability in some parts of the world is a challenge. And definitely when it comes to seafood supply chains, overfishing.
Right. Okay.
Is one of the biggest vulnerabilities.
Okay, so we'll come back to that and discuss what we do about that. Andrew, what is your view about the vulnerabilities you see in the real world in the supply chain, the food supply chain?
Well, from my experience, the supply chains, food supply chain in general, are fairly robust in dealing with unidimensional shocks. So if you have one event that is affecting one country, one factory, one place, or one line of the supply chain itself, the capability to reaccommodate and to react to that is fairly good. We have seen that through the many crises that we have been seeing over the last years, and as Professor mentioned, it's a growing number of disruptions happening. However, the biggest vulnerability in my view, and I think that was highlighted with COVID, is the fact that the supply chains are getting extremely long as a result of the optimization of the businesses. And when you have an impact that is very wide, affecting a lot of people, a lot of countries, a lot of steps of the value chain at the same time, that length plays a huge challenge for the supply chain in terms of vulnerability.
And what's changed from that? I mean, what's changed now to the past? Why this vulnerability and why the long supply chains? Very quickly, Andre.
Well, I think with globalization, what has happened is that we started to have more interconnected supply chains, optimizing unit economics, getting a more connected world in terms of extracting the best value for the business involved in the supply chain. And that has created extremely long and complex supply chains. Previously, we had more local, smaller, shorter supply chains. And with the creation of that long chain, we started to have that as a new challenge for it.
Okay, very clear, very clear.
Yeah, so I think picking up on that theme, I think we've all seen with the pandemic, in fact, the ongoing pandemic, concerns and worries about the food supply chain, queues in supermarkets and the stockouts. So I wonder how real is this risk to the food supply chain? And perhaps, Rajesh, you can go into a bit more detail about the specific risks that may be facing the food industry in the midst or highlighted by the pandemic.
Sure. Can we go to the slide, please? So yes, supply chains face multiple risks on a day-to-day basis. There's a category of risks which every supply chain manager is aware of, and they know how to deal with them. And here I'm talking about supply delays, quality issues. These are what we call known unknowns. But a risk like pandemic, those are what we call unknown unknowns. Those are risks which are almost impossible to forecast in terms of their timing and severity. So for those risks, and so for food supply chain, for example, there are environmental risks because of the climate change, as I referred to earlier. There's increasing floods and droughts around the world. We also see a lot of food wastage in food supply chains. I mean, even in this pandemic, we heard of there's a demand for food, but there is shortage, or not shortage, spoilage at the same time. You've heard of cases of farmers feeding their cattle lettuce and strawberries because there's no market for them. They cannot ship them anywhere. Right. And then finally, there is the issue of every week, almost every week, you hear of one recall or another in food supply chain because of some sort of contamination. So I feel these are all the big risks that food supply chains face today.
Okay, and do you think these risks are more pronounced, say, for the food industry compared to, say, the electronics industry? Are there specific risks for this food supply chain?
So food supply chain, there are two big differences in food versus other products. There's a shelf life and there's handling.
Right.
So if you don't have proper handling in the supply chain, and if you don't maintain the shelf life, then the food gets spoiled.
Right, okay. So we've identified quite a number of risks here you can see on the chart. Now we've identified these. What would you say are the strategies for mitigating those risks, for countering these risks to the supply chain, to the food supply chain? So what can we do about this?
Right. So if you want to make your supply chains, in this case, food supply chain resilient, there are a few strategies. Risks or disruptions to supply chains are not new. We have seen risks, disruptions in other supply chains. 2011, we had a Japanese tsunami, we had floods in Thailand. And for example, the floods in Thailand affected the electronics industry, hard disk drive industry specifically. And companies have been working to make their supply chain resilient, and they follow some strategies. And some of those strategies can also be applied to food supply chains. For example, having stockpile inventory, as we call it in supply chain. And Singapore does a good job of that, right? We have seen, and you can stockpile certain kind of products, grains and rice and wheat. Definitely you cannot stockpile short shelf life products like fresh produce or dairy or meats. The second strategy, again, you hear of Singapore following, and we'll talk about that later, is this idea of localizing or regionalizing supply chains. As Andre mentioned, supply chains are becoming more global, which exposes them to more risks and more disruptions. So if you can localize or regionalize to a certain extent the supply chain, and in this context, I can refer to the Singapore's 30 by 30 target. And finally, in order to be more resilient, supply chains can diversify. Okay? Singapore, for example, imports food from 170 countries. That's amazing amount of diversification, right? And I was blown up to know that Singapore imports 50% of poultry and 30% of beef and even pork from Brazil. I think most of it is in frozen form, but so that they have diversification. But at the same time, I want to emphasize that while we want to make our supply chains, food supply chains resilient, we want to provide cheap and plentiful food to our population. We want to make sure that we still source from ethical sources, and we source from environmentally sustainable sources.
Right. I think some participants in this webinar may not be fully aware of what you mean by 30 by 30. Could you perhaps give some more details on this?
So Singapore has this target of, so right now Singapore's food production, local food production is 10% of the total amount that they need. The target is that by 2030, Singapore should be producing 30% of its food requirement locally.
So that's in 10 years' time.
Right. Okay. Right now it's 10%, as I said, right now it's only 10%.
Is that 10% very low compared to other countries?
Maybe Andre can say that more about that.
Right.
Andre, what do you think?
Well, I think it goes hand in hand with the resources and availability of resources that we have in Singapore, and again, the optimization of the businesses in light of an open market economy that we have here in Singapore with globalization. So as you mentioned very well, Professor, yes, 50% of the poultry coming from Brazil and a large portion of the pork and the beef as well. That has to do with the diversification, access, quality, and prices, plentiful, good quality, affordable meat coming from different sources. And obviously Singapore doesn't have the resources to produce all of that in the Singapore land and resource constriction scenario.
Okay, Andre, on that point, if I can just ask you the question, with the continuous changing landscapes that we have heard the professor say, and you intimated earlier on, and the change in sourcing dynamics in the supply chain, there are clearly a lot of complexities. Could you share with us what are these complexities in the supply chain, and how can we attain the sustainability in the face of all the different variables and players in the market? Now, and I believe you have a slide on this, right?
Yes, the next slide could help a little bit. So, well, I think both in terms of resilience and sustainability for supply chain, I think what I like to say is that to start with, just bring in the supply chain, a very brief, oversimplified draft of meat supply chain here, to show what I like to say, that the supply chain is extremely robust and fragile at the same time. When I say fragile, I mean that there are so many lines and dots in the supply chain. It's extremely long, so many things can go wrong and affect it. All the operational complexities related to each one of them. It could be an issue with the seed farms, with the crops, with the production of the feed, animal feed, or a truck driver strike in a selected country. So all of those things can happen, and this makes it extremely fragile, but at the same time it's extremely robust. And when I say it's robust, it's because despite all that and all the crises we have been through, the supply chain can reaccommodate and work fairly well. So to me, when it comes to what's the biggest challenge to make it more resilient and sustainable, it's always about balancing that willingness to make it more profitable and more optimized in terms of unit economics, related to all of the complexities and resource availability, to make it a good business during good times. I think that overall, considering operational complexities and business complexities, to me, that's the biggest challenge.
So Andre, looking at your chart, which is quite a simplified chart, but it shows how complex the model is. Who is actually maneuvering and controlling the different steps in preventing the fragility or the breakdown of what should be a robust process?
That's an extremely good question, because there's no single player managing the entirety of this chain. You do have players, especially the vertically integrated upstream producers, like the one I came from, BRF, who are controlling from buying the seed all the way to combine the grains, all the way to the exports of meat, raw meat. And this is a very long chain, and selected players have this ability to have that vertically integrated in some countries. But other than those players, most of the business players are in only one specific line connecting two dots, or in one specific dot. And the system kind of auto-regulates with the business acting on their own interest.
Okay, so my next question to you, Andre, is what are the added attentions that are now required to maintain this sustainable food supply, bearing in mind all the variables potentially that could disrupt the situation? And I think also here you might have a slide as well to share with us.
Yeah, so I think that again, both from the sustainability and resilience side, I think that applies as well. And later I'll come back to this slide. So I like to split into three buckets. And number one is having a very holistic and pragmatic understanding of what are your resources, sources, and capabilities that you have in hand. I think that's the number one. That pragmatic understanding will give you a clear reading of what are your risks in terms of what is under your control, number one. Secondly, it's having the ability to plan and react for events that could happen, in terms of no-nos, as Professor said, or eventually even more extreme scenarios that you might not know what the challenges are, the assumptions are, but you may simulate what the results could be. So that's number two, ability to plan and react to diverse scenarios. And then number three, how do you buffer up for the time that it takes for you to navigate between what you have under your control or what you have under your mitigation plans. Right. And that connects very well with what Singapore has done so well. When I say about what is under your control, I think local production, and then emphasize here by the 30 by 30 mentioned briefly by Professor, that could be one example of what you can have under your control, having parts of it under your control. When it comes to ability to plan and react to diverse scenarios and find alternatives, I think that Singapore does that extremely well with source diversification, as mentioned by Professor as well. And then when it comes to buffer up for shocks, knowing that the time to maneuver, it's relatively long, that's what this stockpiling or the buffering serves us for.
Okay.
And Singapore, again, does that extremely well.
So Andre, I get the balancing, I get the optimization, I get the financial equilibrium, I get the profitability, etc. And you also say that people can control what they're doing, but somebody's going to drop the ball. Who, end of the day, picks up the bill? Where's the financial risk in the supply chain? Because if a guy in the middle of the road drops it, is it the guy at the end who's buying the import of the product, or is the guy who drops the ball? How does it work in real life?
It usually affects everyone down the road.
Okay.
For most of the cases we have seen, and we have been through many cases, be upstream at BRF, be downstream. But obviously, the further down you are, the more likely it is for you to have a wider impact. But at the same time, you may have more choices and diversity of sources for you to choose from as well.
Okay, so my point is everybody has to take a stake in the sustainability and this robustness of the supply chain, right? This is what you're saying.
Absolutely right.
I'm going to bring in some questions from the audience, but Prof, can I ask you for your view about this fragility and this robustness concept which Andre has introduced? I mean, how realistic is that going forward from a sustainability angle?
Sorry, I'm trying to understand the question. Can you say that again?
So, okay. So basically, Andre is saying, look, we got to balance the fragility, balance the robustness, balance the risk, etc. But and then that's a very tight juggling process. What is your view from standing outside of the industry, looking in? How does that look to you?
How does it look to me? The fragility in the supply chain, or how do we overcome that?
The fragility in the supply chain. Yes.
Yeah, and sorry, I'm still trying to understand your question.
Okay. Okay, Prof, I'll come back to you in a minute then. Let me take a couple of questions from the audience, right? Bob?
Yes, so we do encourage questions from our audience this morning. The first one is from Sanjeev Deshmukh, and he's asking, are there any special challenges for the sustainability of the food supply chains of emerging economies? So the focus on emerging economies. So our panelists have any views on this? We look at the sustainability of supply chains in emerging economies, either Rajesh or Andre.
I can say that when you talk about emerging economies, a lot of food supply chains maybe originated from there. That's where more farming is taking place. And that's where farmers are the ones most at risk. And that's what I said earlier when I said, every stakeholder in the supply chain should benefit from the food supply chain.
Okay. We have another question here. This is from Tim Foote, and he's asking, what policies can governments implement to aid sustainable sourcing? This is something that should be done, but it seems not to be happening. Do you agree with that? What can the government, is the government doing enough?
Well, don't know specifically which government he's talking about.
Well, governments, I think in general.
So I think certification is what they can require or impose on different food supply chains. Right now, I see some companies doing that. For example, I'll talk about that. Walmart, when they procure their seafood, they are insisting on certification. They only procure source from certified suppliers. So that's where governments can come in and insist, or maybe have mechanisms in place for certification that the food is sourced from organic sources, ethical sources, sustainable sources, for example.
Right. Could I just intervene there? Andre, on the certification by governments, how does the compliance work in the real world? Because clearly certification means that there's going to be a compliance process in the line. How does it work?
Absolutely right. I think the compliance to certification is one of the biggest challenges, especially when you have bans on the upstream into economies that are not exactly under your control. And in many cases, you have extremely corrupt countries and chains involved. So the question goes back to who are the certificating bodies? How much can you trust them? And you may end up generating unbalances that be false certifications, be tainted systems in a way to the ones that are really doing it may actually be on a worse position. So it's extremely challenging to balance those two aspects, although the drive is happening, especially in Europe to start with, and in developed countries to increase.
Okay, thanks, Andre. Bob, back to you. I think there's more questions coming through, right?
Yeah. Do we want to take a question now? Or should we?
Yes, another couple of questions if on the, because I think there's some interesting.
Okay, let me take this one. This is about how are local food importers mitigating export control from governments, especially during the COVID-19 situation, and how is this affecting Singapore's food supplies? And any thoughts on that? Export control by various governments. How is it affecting food supplies, more specifically Singapore's food supplies?
Well, if I may, from my experience and what I have seen, I think that the exports haven't been affected drastically in terms of the outcome here in Singapore. While yes, we have been seeing issues with out of stocks in the supermarket and so on, but that's in the end mostly due to the supply chain downstream, reaccommodating from restaurants to supermarkets, everyone going to the supermarkets more frequently, and then having that supply chain working to be able to cope with that demand and then also when you had an increase overall of purchases of those selected products from supermarket perspective, you're not running out of supply chain and food, but you may be running out of those specific topics. So far, the export restrictions that may have happened have not impacted drastically Singapore from what I have seen from my experience as an importer, and also looking at it now in my new role. But you're absolutely right. That's a topic that may happen and we should be aware of.
Okay, thank you, Andre.
Okay, Bob, I think we'll go on. We'll have chance for more questions later on. I'd like to move now to the technology in the food supply chain. Professor Rajesh, I think this is an area which can help greatly. So how is technology being deployed in the food supply chains, and is it enough to guarantee the sustainability objectives that we believe are necessary for certification, for compliance, for continuity, and all the issues that all the challenges that we have identified?
Yeah, so can we go to the slide, please? So yes, technology is being used and it's required, and it's helping in mainly two ways. One is a traceability. So we see technologies such as RFID, blockchain-based applications, which can help with traceability. Then the other field where technology is being used is in managing the shelf life. For example, maintaining temperature of products as they travel through the supply chain. At the same time, as we said earlier, certification is important and technology can help with that also. Right. Now the slide that you see here, actually it talks more about, this is mainly about seafood sustainability. But, it's talking about the different pillars that Walmart, for example, has in their strategy to source sustainable seafood. Right. So besides making sure that it doesn't harm the environment, they do responsible sourcing, they make sure the products are safe and healthier, and there is transparency in the supply chain. And they do that by, as I said earlier, making sure that all the suppliers are certified. Right. So yes, technology can help, and it can mainly help in, just to recap, traceability and in managing shelf life.
Right, okay. Andre, is technology moving fast enough? Are companies adopting technology at a speed that will help us mitigate some of these issues, or are we still a long way behind?
From my own experience, I think we're still a long way behind, but there's a growing drive, and this drive is probably accelerated further now with COVID. The way I like to see on how technology plays, a part here in how companies should probably better adopt to the new, not the new scenario, but to the realization that this scenario could happen, just like what happened with COVID, is that an extremely important portion of this is making sure that all your admin, operational, back office, from sourcing, from the managed supply planning, from warehouse management, transport management, whichever angle you look at from the supply chain, needs to be seamless. When I say needs to be seamless, it could involve both processes and technology. And when it comes to technology, then digitalization is a very important point here. And the reason why I say that this is so important is because during crisis and during events like what has happened, you have to basically reorganize your entire supply chain or entire company. And that obviously is a huge spike in the workload. And if you're not prepared for that, if your systems and processes are not built to take it on a seamless manner, it can be extremely disruptive. So that's how I see that the technology playing a part on supporting that. But obviously, with COVID, this has also highlighted the need that on top of being seamless and digital, we should also plan for it to be remote.
Right. Andre,
I think,
Andre, digitalization is a big word, covers many things. Which part of digitalization do you think would really help in the supply chain? You got the physical side and you got the data side or the flow side. Where do you see the most important attention should be put in now as a priority?
When it comes about resilience, I would say that the attention is more on the upstream side. So the demand planning side, the sourcing side, making sure that you have it all digitalized, seamless, well-controlled, in a system that is easy to access, information is widely available, and that you can easily contact your suppliers, your shipping lines, and have that clear visibility so you can plan it. From a resilience perspective, that is more urgent, but obviously further downstream, you have to manage it.
Interesting. Excellent. So upstream demand planning, demand visibility, inventory control is very important. The Prof talked about the physical track and trace, shelf life tracking. Excellent. So there's still a long way to go. Now, I think there's some more questions in the pipeline there. Bob, do you have something more?
Yes, we have a question which is about Southeast Asia. It's talking about what structural impediments does the panel see in this region that are driving up the cost of food, A, driving up the cost of food, and B, affecting the efficiency of the food sourcing. Structural impediments in Southeast Asia. Rajesh or Andre, do you have any thoughts on this?
I'll pass that to Andre. He's the practitioner.
Okay, Andre. Structural impediments in Southeast Asia.
Well, I wouldn't be able to categorize in Southeast Asia as one group in this topic. It's extremely diverse country by country, and the elements of challenges that you face in Singapore, Indonesia, and Malaysia are extremely different country by country, or Thailand or whatever. So I think that must be on a more specific country basis, and each one have a very different driver and reality. Yeah.
Sure. Okay. Bob, anything else?
Yeah, we still have time for more questions. Let me see.
Yes, please. Yeah, we have.
Okay, I'll take this one. Let me see what it is. Yeah, I think that's more of a comment than a question. But can I come back to a point that Rajesh made earlier on? You talked about supply chain risks for the food industry being nothing new, but is there anything new that you're seeing with respect to the COVID pandemic? Is there something new that we're seeing this year? So
with COVID, so we saw a lot of places where food handling, processing was taking place. When the workers get infected, those plants have to be shut down.
Okay, that's a good point, yeah. And that's something which you've not seen before.
Right.
Okay, that's interesting.
Yeah, I think another interesting thing from COVID that was rather alarming is that it's the first, at least from the modern history now with globalized supply chain, is the first time that we see such a wide and concurrent impact across the chain, across all countries. And this is from shipping lines not having the operation, the containers in place, factories being stopped, from supermarkets running out of shelf, workers not being able to cross borders. This is the first time in the recent history.
But Andre, on that question again, we come back to the vulnerabilities and the challenges. And because of so many issues that have now been highlighted by COVID, shouldn't governments be more involved in creating some regulation to balance, to govern, maybe also incentivize operators and the food chain to automate better? Is this something that is being discussed, or is it something important, not important? What do you think? And then I'll ask the Prof the same question.
Yeah, well, from a business perspective, remember when I said that the business will always look for the most profitable chain, even if it's very long and fragile and during crisis. And this may be an issue. And this is, I think there are elements of policies that could support that specific drive. And I think Singapore has been doing brilliantly in specific topics such as, source diversification, forcing or supporting that as much as possible. But at the same time, whenever we talk about policies and drive specific, it goes back to what is the country's view. Each specific country have their own view. I'm not entering into the merit if it's right or wrong. but they have their own view on what should be governed by the government of that specific country, or what should be an open free market. And that balance is something that we're seeing a little bit of shaking up in the world. And I think that's ultimately the first driver for that question.
Okay. Very quickly, Prof, on the same question, should governments get more involved, regulate, incentivize automation technology?
Automation, I'm not sure, but I think that I see the government's role in, as I said earlier, ensuring certificates, there are certifications available. And also, for example, in emerging countries, where the sourcing originates, the supply chains originate,
right?
Ensuring that farmers are paid a living wage, ensuring that farmers have incentive to switch to, for example, organic farming, if that is what is better for the long term of the supply chain, long-term sustainability of the supply chain.
Okay, that's interesting. Incentivizing farmers, incentivizing developing country sources. Okay.
Yeah, we have a question, Joe, which is something picking up on Rajesh's point just now about workers being affected. So, I mean, are we seeing that countries are actually tightening their food processing factories in order to protect those workers and, by extent, the products during COVID-19? Is enough of that being done, that kind of interventionist activity being done?
Well, I think that I don't know how familiar you are, the meat industry is the one in the real spotlight now, right?
Yeah.
And coming from the meat industry, I keep asking myself, what's the solution for that? To be honest, I don't think it's anywhere near, and there are a few reasons, structural reasons for that. The nature of the activity itself, it's extremely hard to automate in full. I think that's number one challenge. Right. And then obviously you have pressures of cost and prices everywhere, and meat business are not profitable anymore. If you look at it across the board, it's a business that's getting less and less profitable. So it's not that they have a lot of room to play around with increase of costs as well. And then at the same time, that requires a lot of workers doing manual work, which is hard to automate inside a cold environment, processing meat. And that's a terrible combination. I think this is why the meat industry is struggling right now. Okay. Personally, I don't see a clear path to solve it.
Oh, okay. Sounds quite severe. Okay, thank you.
We've run out of time, Bob. Let's move to the next point, because that's great. I mean, there's a lot of interesting discussion here, but go ahead.
Yeah, I know we touched on the Singapore 3030 initiative earlier on, but is there anything that panelists would like to say on this issue? Any further thoughts on this?
Yeah, so this goal that Singapore has of 30 by 30, it's a noble goal, but Singapore, as I think Andre can elaborate further later on, has constraints of land and water.
Right.
So in addition to farming, I think Singapore should also aim for maybe processing and manufacturing piece of the supply chain rather than simply farming, because you do have the constraints, right? It's a small country.
Right.
And I give you an example. Also, the second point I want to make is we can also look at vertically integrating our supply chains. So give you an example of Morrison's grocery chain in UK. They claim to have highly vertically integrated supply chain, in that they own their meat processing plants, they own their bakeries, they even own their produce packing plants. The advantage they say they do that is because it provides them low price, transparency, and traceability. Now for Singapore, what is important is security. And I think vertical integration can give you that security. And it doesn't necessarily have to go all the way to farming. It can maybe stop at processing or manufacturing.
Right, okay.
Okay, Andre, any further thoughts on 3030?
Yeah, I mean, to me, that's one of the most exciting and challenging initiatives that I have seen in my life, and one of the boldest. The key question that I keep asking myself related to it is what, as Professor mentioned, if we were to simply, obviously, build the full chain from meat, for example, for Singapore, even internal consumption, that there's no land for it, and tens of times the land of Singapore and water. So take that possibility aside. I think the question that outlines here is, what should it be internalized? As Professor said, it could be processing, it could be a trade hub, it could be value add, and we really don't know. Obviously, it's an extremely huge challenge, but I think the work to internalize and then subsequently after you decide what to internalize and how to make sure that this is feasible, also how to make it competitive in an open market economy, considering the cost structure of Singapore.
So it sounds like a difficult target, going from 10% to 30% within a decade. It's a tough target. Would you agree?
Yes, I would think so.
Yeah.
But Prof, can I ask you a question? I think you and Andre put it very nicely. I mean, you're talking about vertical integration, internalization, reducing the risk in the pipeline. But aren't we sort of reversing some of the trends in terms of outsourcing, in terms of free trade, and aren't we going to a more protectionist type of environment? Or is this necessary given the conditions we're in now?
Well, yeah, so to a certain extent, and every country is talking about that now, and now faced with this pandemic, that we need to, at least for essential supply chains, we need to localize them. We need to have more control, more security.
Right.
So that is going to be one of the outcomes of, as we come out of this pandemic.
Right. Okay.
Yeah, and Joe, I would see that Singapore is probably a very special case in which, yes, I think that the discussion is very valid and it's happening. It's clearly happening. The government is pushing, but at the same time, doing that within what Singapore is known for, and that's the biggest challenge: the open market economy. How to do that by making the business feasible. I think this is what the biggest challenge is.
Okay. Excellent. I'll be interested to see how free trade agreements start evolving after this takes place, because that's going to be another challenge itself. Okay, Bob, do we have any interesting questions we would like to field to our guests before we wrap up?
Oh, we have a comment. We have a comment from Thomas Sung, who tells us that China did in fact penalise food importers who failed in COVID-19 handling. If you remember the salmon incident from a few weeks ago. So he believes that supply chain security needs to be improved. We do have another question. I don't know whether we have time to go into this. It's about the halal supply chain and whether there's specific aspects of that that need to be looked at, so that is not disrupted or contaminated. I don't know whether the panel have any thoughts or experience about the halal food supply chain.
Don't have much experience, but all I can say is halal food supply chains definitely needs to be completely separate from non-halal supply chain. That's one of the characteristics of.
Yeah.
But if you want to maintain traceability, if you want to maintain security of halal.
Yeah, but I would imagine, Prof, it has the same vulnerabilities and same risks as a normal supply chain, right?
Right, same.
So it's just a different stream, but it's same family of issues that we have to discuss with. Okay, gentlemen, it's been a fantastic discussion. There's a lot more we can talk about, but unfortunately we run out of time. So again, thank you for all the discussion points and the inputs and questions from the audience. So I'd like to just ask Prof and Andre to, let's wrap up now. I mean, what are your takeaways, Prof, from the recent crisis, and how should we be thinking about the future moving forward in terms of developing further our supply chains with technology, looking at defensive strategies, looking at the issues that we've just summarized that in your takeaway thoughts, please?
Yeah, so to me, the biggest takeaway would be this, that disruptions are going to be the norm.
Right.
Whether they're man-made or natural, disruptions are going to be there in the supply chains,
right? Food
supply chain. It's very hard to predict when those disruptions will happen and how deep will they be. I mean, COVID was an abnormality. This is like once in a 100-year pandemic, right? But we do see other disruptions which are not so spread out, which are more localized. But there will be disruptions in your supply chains, especially when they are so global. So all you can do as a supply chain manager, as a country, as a company, is to set up and manage a supply chain which is agile and which is diversified. So that if and when a disruption happens, you can quickly come back to original operations.
Excellent, very good. So disruption will be with us with the new norm. This set up agile and diversified supply chains to mitigate these risks. Excellent, thank you, Prof. Andre, what are your takeaways from this?
I think I would say exactly the same 2 points from Prof. Being able to take on those wide impacts that may happen, and then react swiftly to it on an agile manner, as Professor said, to reorganize and to do it, which is also connected to what I mentioned about how digitalization should allow that to happen. And I would add one other element of diversification that it's on the business side as well. So yes, we're talking about supply chain and the sources upstream and even the downstream supply chain and how that connects. But we have seen many cases of businesses that were highly concentrated in one specific sector, be aviation, be hotels, tourism, and then within the food distribution, for example, could be food services or retail. For the business that were highly, in this COVID case, highly concentrated in one, specialized in one sector, like food services and restaurants, obviously they were extremely affected. And then business that had a more balanced approach and diversification on their business side of things as well, on the channels, they actually managed to thrive or to compensate a little bit better. So that's what I would add, that diversification on top of the upstream, on the operational side as well. And when you look at the business, it's really worth it looking at diversification of channels or your business.
So it's a business model rethink you're talking about, Andre, isn't it? Basically rethinking the business model with the added agility, diversification elements, financial, etc. But basically the message here is people need to rethink the model versus carry on as usual. Yeah,
absolutely.
Right.
Yeah, it's very convenient for us to specialize in what we are best, and that's good, and it makes sense many times. But we may always take note that this may be a trap if there is a scenario that affects specifically what we are doing.
Excellent. That's all we have time for. It's been an excellent discussion, and we've only touched the tip of the iceberg. And maybe we'll come back to this argument or discussion later on when we know a little bit more about what's going on with COVID. Prof. Rajesh and Andre, thank you very much for your time. Appreciate your effort and your discussion points, your wisdom and your insight into this topic. I thank you to all the participants who have connected and joined us and the questions you put forward. If we haven't answered your question, we will try and do it offline and come back to you on that. Thank you, Bob, for your support and intervention here. And thank you to everybody for participating. Have a good day, stay safe and stay healthy.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Enjoy the conversation.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Bye-bye. Thank you.
Bye-bye.